Logic might seem like the answer to life's problems, but what if I told you it's actually making things worse? We live in a world obsessed with rational thinking, flowcharts, and decision matrices. Every day, millions of people turn to logic to solve their problems. From career choices to relationship issues, they analyze pros and cons, create spreadsheets, and try to optimize their way to happiness. But there was one philosopher who saw through this entire facade, Søren Kierkegaard. And his warning from the 1800s hits harder today than ever before. Kierkegaard wasn't just writing abstract philosophy, he lived this struggle himself. Here was a man who could outthink pretty much anyone around him, who spent countless nights analyzing every possible angle of every possible decision. But all this thinking led him to a devastating realization. The more he tried to use pure logic to figure out life, the more paralyzed he became. Even his famous engagement to Regine Olsen shows this perfectly. He loved her deeply, had every logical reason to marry her, yet his endless analysis of what marriage meant led him to break off the engagement, a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. But this wasn't just about one man's personal crisis. Kierkegaard saw something terrifying happening in society. As science and reason advanced, people were becoming more anxious, more uncertain, more lost. The more tools we had to analyze life, the harder it became to actually live it. Take his famous example of a man standing on the edge of a cliff. Logic can tell you all about gravity, wind resistance, and the statistical chances of survival if you fall. But at some point, you have to make a choice. Step back or step forward. No amount of thinking can eliminate the fundamental uncertainty of that moment. This is why Kierkegaard's message is so crucial for us today. We're drowning in information, buried under endless options and analyses. People spend hours reading reviews before buying a $10 item. They create complex systems to optimize their daily routines. Dating has become a mathematical game of swipes and algorithms. And yet, despite all this logical optimization, anxiety and depression rates are skyrocketing. Just like Kierkegaard predicted, our attempt to think our way out of every problem is actually creating new ones. Think about the last big decision you made. Did having more information actually make the choice easier? Or did each new piece of data just add another layer of complexity, another angle to consider, another reason to hesitate? This is exactly what Kierkegaard was warning us about. Logic isn't saving us. It's trapping us in an endless loop of analysis, making us more afraid to take actual steps in life. And as we'll see in this video, his solution to this problem wasn't to abandon thinking entirely, but to understand its limits and embrace something far more powerful. Let's dive into who Kierkegaard really was and why his thoughts on logic hit differently than other philosophers. Born in Copenhagen in 1813, Kierkegaard wasn't your typical philosopher sitting in an ivory tower. He was the youngest of 7 children, growing up under a deeply melancholic father who was convinced he had been cursed by God. This curse, his father believed, meant all his children would die before they turned 33, the age of Jesus. Imagine growing up with that hanging over your head. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of rejecting religion or running straight into the arms of pure reason like many of his contemporaries, Kierkegaard used his personal struggles to develop something completely different. He was living in a time when Hegel's systematic philosophy was all the rage. Everyone was obsessed with the idea that you could explain everything through logical systems. It was like the self-help culture of the 1800s. People thought they had finally cracked the code to understanding everything. Kierkegaard saw right through this. He looked at his own life, the death of 5 of his siblings, his complex relationship with his father, his broken engagement with Regine, and realized something profound. None of the big questions in his life could be answered by logic alone. While everyone else was trying to build perfect philosophical systems, Kierkegaard was walking around Copenhagen, talking to ordinary people, and writing under different pen names to show how messy and complicated real life actually is. This is where his 3 stages of existence come in, and they're nothing like the clean, logical progressions other philosophers talked about. The aesthetic stage is where most people start, living for pleasure, trying to maximize happiness through endless choices and possibilities. Think of today's social media culture, always chasing the next dopamine hit. The ethical stage is where people try to live by universal rules and rational principles, like someone who structures their entire life around productivity systems and self-improvement books. But the religious stage, and this is crucial, isn't about joining a church or following dogma. It's about embracing the fact that life's biggest decisions require a leap beyond logic. Kierkegaard wasn't writing this as abstract theory. He was watching the same thing happen in his society that we're seeing today. People were becoming more educated, more rational, more enlightened, and simultaneously more anxious, more uncertain, and more afraid to actually live. He saw how the rise of newspapers and mass media was creating a society of spectators who knew everything but understood nothing. Does this sound familiar? We're living in his predicted future, where information is infinite but wisdom is scarce. One of the most powerful ways Kierkegaard challenged logical thinking was through his analysis of the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac. But don't worry if you're not religious. Kierkegaard used this story to reveal something universal about human existence. Here's the situation. Abraham, supposedly the father of faith, is told by God to sacrifice his own son. From any logical standpoint, this is insane. Either Abraham is hearing voices and should be locked up, or he's about to commit a horrible crime. But Kierkegaard digs deeper in his book Fear and Trembling, which he published under the pen name Johannes de Silentio. He didn't choose this pen name randomly. Silence is key because the whole point is that Abraham can't explain himself logically to anyone. Imagine trying to tell your wife, "Hey, I'm taking our son up a mountain to kill him because God told me to." There's no logical defense for this. No ethical system can justify it. No rational argument can make it make sense. This is where Kierkegaard gets really interesting with his pseudonyms. He wrote under different names not just to hide his identity, but to show how truth looks different from different perspectives. Through Johannes de Silentio, he shows us the ethical observer horrified by Abraham's actions. Through other characters, he shows us different ways of trying to understand faith and decision-making. It's like he's creating a whole Netflix series in book form, with each character representing a different way of approaching life's biggest challenges. His famous line, "Truth is subjectivity," comes from this understanding, but he's not talking about your truth, my truth in some vague modern sense. He's making a more radical point. The most important truths in life can't be proven logically or explained rationally to others. Think about falling in love. You can list all the reasons why you love someone, but those reasons never fully capture the reality of your feelings. Or think about choosing a career. No pros and cons list can tell you with certainty what will make your life meaningful. This challenged everything the intellectual establishment stood for. In Kierkegaard's time, just like today, smart people thought they could think their way through anything. They believed that with enough analysis, every problem could be solved logically. But Kierkegaard pointed out something they were missing: anxiety. Not just regular nervousness, but the fundamental anxiety that comes from being human and having to make choices without complete knowledge. Here's what makes this so relevant today. We're facing the same problems, just with fancier tools. We have AI to analyze our decisions, big data to predict outcomes, and endless information at our fingertips. But people are more anxious than ever. Why? Because like Abraham, we still have to make leaps that logic can't justify. Whether it's changing careers, getting married, having kids, or following your passion, the biggest decisions in life require something beyond rational calculation. This is what made Kierkegaard's ideas so revolutionary. He wasn't just criticizing philosophy. He was describing something fundamental about being human. The real challenge isn't finding more information or better logic. It's finding the courage to act in the face of uncertainty. And as we'll see in the next section, this understanding leads to a completely different way of thinking about how to live. The real problem with logic isn't that it's wrong. It's that it promises something it can never deliver: certainty. Let's look at how this plays out in real life. You're trying to decide whether to quit your stable job for a risky but passionate venture. Logic tells you to analyze the market, crunch the numbers, calculate probabilities. You make spreadsheets, read success stories, study failure rates. But here's what Kierkegaard would point out. No matter how much data you gather, you'll never reach 100% certainty. This is where modern optimization culture becomes almost funny from a Kierkegaardian perspective. People track their sleep, monitor their productivity, measure their steps, analyze their diet, thinking if they just get enough data, they'll crack the code of the perfect life. But look what's happening. The more we try to optimize, the more paralyzed we become. It's like trying to pick a movie on Netflix. The more options we have, the harder it becomes to choose. Take dating apps as a perfect example. They're built on the logical premise that more information leads to better choices. You get detailed profiles, compatibility scores, mutual interests. But Kierkegaard would laugh at this. He'd point out that people in arranged marriages often end up just as happy as those who spent years analyzing potential partners. Why? Because the success of a relationship doesn't depend on logical compatibility. It depends on the irrational commitment two people make to each other. This paralysis of logic shows up everywhere in modern life. Students overthinking their college choice, convinced that one wrong decision will ruin their life. Entrepreneurs stuck in analysis paralysis, forever researching but never launching. Writers blocked not by lack of ideas but by overthinking every possible angle. Kierkegaard saw this coming. He watched as increased knowledge led not to more confidence, but to more anxiety. Here's a mind-bending example he'd appreciate. Studies show that doctors sometimes make better decisions when they have less information. Too much data can cloud their judgment, making them second-guess their experienced intuition. This isn't just interesting. It's terrifying for anyone who believes logic alone can guide us through life. But the real kicker? The more we rely on logic to solve our problems, the more we blame ourselves when we're still unhappy. After all, if you've analyzed everything correctly, followed all the right steps, and you're still miserable, it must be your fault, right? This is the trap of pure rationality. It promises a certainty it can never deliver, then makes us feel like failures when we can't achieve it. And as we'll see next, Kierkegaard's solution to this problem was both radical and surprisingly practical. The leap of faith is probably Kierkegaard's most famous idea, but it's also his most misunderstood. People think it means blindly believing in something without evidence. That's not it at all. What Kierkegaard was talking about was something far more relevant to everyday life, the courage to act despite uncertainty. And this is where things get really interesting. Think about the most successful people you know. Are they the ones who had everything figured out logically before they started? Usually not. They're the ones who were willing to take action while others were still analyzing. Steve Jobs didn't have market research proving people wanted touchscreen phones. He took a leap. Great artists don't logically calculate every brushstroke. They commit to their vision. But here's where Kierkegaard's insight gets deeper. He noticed that passion, real, genuine commitment, can create its own truth. When you truly commit to something, a relationship, a career, a creative project, you're not just betting on existing facts. You're creating new facts through your commitment. It's like learning to ride a bike. No amount of theoretical knowledge can replace the moment you have to pedal and trust you'll find your balance. Modern neuroscience actually backs this up in a way Kierkegaard would have loved. Research shows that our brains make decisions before we're consciously aware of them. All that logical analysis we do, it's often just us trying to justify choices we've already made emotionally. But instead of this being a problem, Kierkegaard would say it's exactly how it should be. The heart knows things the head can't figure out. This is crucial for understanding what Kierkegaard meant by faith. He wasn't talking about religious faith specifically. He was talking about the faith we need to live any meaningful life. Faith in ourselves, faith in our choices, faith that even though we can't see the whole path, taking the first step is worth it. It's the faith an entrepreneur needs to start a business. The faith artists need to share their work. The faith we all need to love someone knowing they could hurt us. Take social anxiety as an example. You can logically know that other people aren't really judging you, that your fears are irrational. But that knowledge alone rarely cures anxiety. What helps is taking action, going to social events, talking to people, building confidence through experience. The leap comes first. The certainty follows. This is Kierkegaard's wisdom applied to real life. Some truths can only be discovered through action, not analysis. Let's get real about what it means to live without using logic as a crutch. But don't worry, this isn't about throwing rationality out the window and living like a chaos goblin. It's about something much more practical, learning when to think and when to act. Kierkegaard would look at our modern world, with its endless self-help books, productivity apps, and decision-making frameworks, and see a bunch of people trying to escape the fundamental truth that life requires courage, more than calculation. Here's what living beyond pure logic actually looks like. Instead of endlessly researching the perfect time to start a business, you start small and learn as you go. Instead of analyzing whether someone is your perfect match, you give yourself permission to feel and connect authentically. Instead of optimizing every minute of your day for productivity, you leave space for the spontaneous moments that often end up being the most meaningful. Look at how anxiety operates in our culture. People think they're anxious because they don't have enough information or haven't thought things through enough. So they research more, analyze more, think more. But often this just feeds the anxiety. Kierkegaard would say that anxiety isn't a problem to be solved. It's a sign that you're faced with real possibilities. The solution isn't more thinking, it's learning to act meaningfully, despite the uncertainty. This hits especially hard in our age of infinite information. We can Google anything, compare everything, analyze forever. But this abundance of knowledge often makes us more confused, not less. Why? Because we're looking for logical certainty in areas of life where it doesn't exist. No amount of research can tell you with absolute certainty if you should marry someone, change careers, or move to a new city. At some point, you have to trust your experience, your instincts, and yes, even your emotions. But here's the most liberating part of Kierkegaard's message. Once you stop expecting logic to save you, you actually become better at using it. When you accept that some decisions require leaps of faith, you can use logic as a tool rather than a crutch. You can think deeply about things while knowing that thinking alone isn't enough. You can plan while staying open to the unplannable. You can be rational while acknowledging that some of life's most important truths aren't reached through rationality alone. This is Kierkegaard's ultimate warning and gift to us. In a world obsessed with certainty, data, and optimization, he reminds us that the most meaningful parts of life require embracing uncertainty, taking leaps and finding the courage to act even when we can't calculate all the outcomes. Because in the end, life isn't a problem to be solved, it's an experience to be lived.